And for more insight on the global economy, I'm joined by John Herrmann, Director of U.S. Rate Strategies at Mitsubishi UFJ Securities. John, always good to have you.
It's great to be back.
Especially on the Friday before Labor Day. Thanks for making it.
It's okay. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's talk about this jobs number.
Yes.
First and foremost, what was it? 173,000 jobs created, 40,000 less than expected. What does this mean regarding lift off the Fed raising interest rates?
Okay, that's a key question. The number actually came out kind of close to our forecast. We were around the 180s, 180,000. What we saw in the report, we saw some positives. The unemployment rate, as you know, declined. It's now in the middle of the range.
But how much of that is about labor participation?
We've gone back and forth on that, and we both know that a good chunk of that is the declining labor force participation. But in fact, though, it's in the midpoint of where the Fed expects the unemployment rate to be over the next couple of years. So we're already sort of achieved that goal. But then when you look around at the rest of the report, what we saw is some features that didn't really please us. One, as you mentioned, labor force did not grow. First. Second thing is the household survey is suggesting that the job growth is not as good as what we're seeing in the payrolls overall. And it's also clear to us that the payroll growth is decelerating year on year. It's slowing.
So certainly doesn't sound like it's leverage for a raise rate.
It does not sound like a straightforward call on Fed hiking in the middle of the month. And then you add in sort of the uncertainty in financial markets, volatility overseas, weakness in emerging markets in terms of not just their growth, but also in their stock market performance. It suggests there's more things going at work here.
Absolutely. There's a lot to consider. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is concerned about the impact of a Fed raising rates on the global economy. Yes. Why? Why does that matter?
It's a very big deal because what we've seen, the first market of all the markets who had a strong belief that the Fed would hike this year were the foreign exchange markets. So the bond market had been leaning at the beginning of the year and over the course of the winter, the bond market had been leaning towards a hike this year. But the FX markets really priced it in, and priced in not just one hike, but a series of hikes. So they strengthened the dollar against a whole basket of currencies, including really strengthening it versus the emerging market currencies. And that precipitated a lot of strains in their countries.
Why is it a big problem if the Fed raises rates? Does that mean that all of the U.S. dollar-denominated debts just got a lot more expensive?
Becomes more expensive for all the emerging markets, and we know that China is actually not the leader in that area, but a very high user of U.S. dollars.
Well, let's talk about China, because the IMF is also concerned about the growth prospects in China. We saw a global market sell-off based on, well, supposedly triggered by an RMB devaluation and the Chinese stock market, which is not that linked to the economy in China, but nonetheless. How concerned are you about China?
I think it's a big deal. When we heard the Vice Chair Fisher for the Fed address the China question last week at Jackson Hole, he said that the direct direct effect on the U.S. is small because China is relatively still a small component of our export markets. But when you look at the entire impact of China on the global economy, it's very, very large. So we are concerned about this because what for us it means, we're already observing recessions, for example, in Canada, in Brazil, in Russia, and we're worried about recessions in Japan now. We're worried about a recession in Australia, in Turkey. It's broadening out, and part of it is the slowdown in China affecting these other countries.
Still, the IMF is forecasting GDP growth at 6.8% for China for the year. That still sounds like a pretty soft landing to me.
It sounds like a soft landing. The only issue is are those numbers really hard numbers, or might the actual growth be something closer to 5% or possibly a little lower?
That's the IMF forecast.
So exactly. So that's my concern is that the actual numbers may be a little bit weaker than the IMF's suggestion, which would explain why it is that the growth is slowing so rapidly in places like Brazil and Australia and the like.
Well, China is probably high on the agenda for the G20 finance and central bankers meeting that's taking place in Turkey. What do you expect to come out of that?
I think what they need to do, they're not going to be so forceful as to criticize one country and so on. But what they're going to do is they need to address a few global issues. One is we are so reliant upon QE globally that will create some, potentially very adverse consequences down the road. So I think they're going to say something about that. On the other hand, they also want to say things that, we need to promote more free trade, we need to promote more internal growth, we need to encourage countries, for example, like China, to move more into a more competitive, free operating, more balanced type economy, a little bit less reliant purely on exports, that kind of thing. So they walk a delicate rope, and I think expect a delicate, but behind the scenes, I think they're more frank in their discussions with each other.
Well, we should hope so. We should hope something happens more concretely behind the scenes. Thank you so much, as always,
Micheele.
John Herrmann, Director of U.S. Rate Strategies at Mitsubishi UFJ Securities.